Now, it may have been delayed, but in the end, we were treated to an iconic race and an all-time classic for the 108th running of the Indy 500. And it was arguably the two best oval drivers in the world that ended up going head-to-head towards the end of the race, as Josef Newgarden and Pato O'Ward left it all on the line. In the end, it was Newgarden who triumphed and became the first man to go back-to-back at the 500 since Helio Castroneves all the way back in 2002. Now let's take a look at the results. It was Josef Newgarden who triumphed and finished first, being pushed all the way to the end by Pato O'Ward. Scott Dixon, Alexander Rossi and Alex Palou finished the top five out, with Scott McLaughlin coming in 6th, Kyle Kirkwood in 7th and Santino Ferrucci in 8th. And rounding out the top 10, we have Rinus VK in 9th and Connor Daly in 10th. Just outside of the top 10, we have Eilert and Rasmussen, and the three Rahal Letterman drivers, Lundgaard, Sato and Rahal, in 13th, 14th and 15th. In 16th is Rob, 17th Carpenter and 18th Kyle Larson. 19th has Roman Grosjean and 20th is Helio Castroneves. My name is Steph Wentworth, and joining me to break down what was an absolutely iconic race is Joey Barnes. Joey, you're on the ground there. How was that for you?
That was one of the most intense races I've ever had the privilege of covering. It was just immaculate.
I think, first of all, we should talk about the incredible finish to the race, because how did Pato O'Ward come into play after being so quiet for the majority of the race and in the build-up, and how good was that final fight with Josef Newgarden?
Well, I mean, one, it was really, really staggering to see how he came back into play. You look at Pato, wasn't maybe quite as strong as what we saw last year, or even the year before, right, as a front runner, but through pit strategy, being able to get the overcut quite a few times there, he managed to climb back in and claw back in. And in his words, I mean, he was fighting the flu all week, and so he felt good enough to go. And I remember in the post race, he talked about how he took that car beyond its limits and was really surprised by what it could do, and didn't expect to sometimes come home with it, but still managed to see it through. And there was just a grit that he displayed yesterday that was just unbelievable. I mean, absolutely drove his rear end off, came through the field. It really set the tone after that final stint on that final pit stop. I mean, he was coming through in 4th. He was originally used as a pick by Newgarden on Alexander Rossi, as those two were battling for what would have cycled to 2nd, as Newgarden eventually went up and got a hold of Scott Dixon and passed him. As you look at how this thing played out for that final run, I mean, you had Rossi and Newgarden really tingling as Dixon faded. Eventually, Pato got around Dixon, started to make hay, and I think it was right around 6-7 to go that you saw him O'Ward put a really crafty move on his teammate and Alexander Rossi that really put some distance between those two, and ended up leading to where it was just a mano-a-mano Newgarden versus O'Ward fight. It was one for the ages too. I mean, you look at that situation with how that played out. Pato goes and grabs the lead. About 5 laps to go. Josef comes back, retaliates, gets that lead back, and then Pato continues to start building up his run and trying to figure out where he was going to make that pass and just kind of ease out of the throttle. And it set up a beautiful finish. I mean, Pato comes out of turn 4, coming to the white flag, gets on the outside of Newgarden, barrels down into turn 1 as they go wheel to wheel. Technically makes the what would have been the race winning pass had it gone status quo into turn 1, which has been par for course. And then who would have thought 2 corners later that Josef was able to retaliate with his own outside maneuver wheel to wheel. I mean, there was no room for error on that final bend. I mean, with turn 3, they were just inches apart, and if Pato just loosens the wheel a hair, they're both end up in the fence. So it was just immaculate driving by both of them. It was a staggering move by Josef. I still don't even understand how he was able to follow Pato, but yeah, it was just absolute heartbreak at the end for Pato.
Yeah, and we saw kind of both sides of the coin there, because Josef was absolutely elated with that victory, and we saw it in the interview at the end. But what we also saw was, the absolute heartbreak that Pato was feeling, and I think we could all really feel that through the TV and you in person.
I mean, that's why he's a fan favorite, right? I mean, he wears his heart on his sleeve, like he said in that post race interview. Might have dropped an expletive in the post race interview as well. I think we could all feel that emotion, and I think it's so valuable to feel that too. I mean, there's so few times in motorsport where sometimes it feels too corporate, too polished. These guys just go and they're talented and they collect their paycheck, and it's whatever. It's nice to see, and it's refreshing to see what the magnitude of this race really means to someone. I mean, we're talking about a driver in Pato who 2 years ago in 2022 was going into turn one on the outside of Marcus Ericsson, backed out just because it was going to probably lead to both of them crashing, and had his racecraft called into question, had his desire called into question, ends up finishing second in that race. And that was on the final lap. Last year, battling Marcus Ericsson again, goes into turn three, sends it, doesn't make it out the other side of that, and crashes. And in this case, what do? This time you're on the inside, you're at turn three. He managed to pull off that pass in turn one. And in some ways, it was beautiful poetry to what he wasn't able to do in 2022. But, unfortunately, just turn three came up and ended up coming up short.
Yeah, well, it was a very interesting race all around, but it had a high attrition rate, should we say, with only 23 of the 33 cars actually finishing. How much of that do you think was down to kind of the delays? Because obviously we were waiting a while, unsure whether or not we would get underway. Finally we did, and it's a good thing that we did. But how much was that affecting all 33 cars on the grid?
I think it played a huge factor. We didn't know if the weather was coming back. There was a second weather cell that was expected to develop about 4.5 hours after we took the green flag from the 4-hour delay. And, with Indiana weather, as they like to say, it's so unpredictable around this racetrack. You don't know if you're going to get a pop-up shower at any moment. We're just trying to make it to lap 101 in this situation. But I think also we ended up dealing with really cool track conditions by the end of it. I mean, that final hour and a half, really, those are track conditions that these guys had never practiced in. We've never practiced after 6 p.m. here, unless there was a brief extension, but that just wasn't a possibility throughout the running. And track conditions during practice were running in 130s, even in qualifying, 130 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in Celsius terms, I'm going to be honest.
Much lower.
Much lower. So, but you look at that, and whenever you fall back to what it developed to be in the race, it actually dropped by 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was just a dramatic pull in weather. It brought out a lot of grip, put these guys on a razor's edge, guys and girls on a razor's edge. And what was unbelievable to me, though, is that it was elbows out the whole time. And like I said, I mean, with it being easily one of the most intense 500s, it certainly surprised me because, and there's quite a few media members that I talked to, quite a few people in the paddock that I ended up talking to, and this event was feeling kind of flat in the build up to this, whether it was weather, whether it was just kind of a going through the motions, which is surprising when you had a superstar like Kyle Larson in the field coming over from NASCAR, but there was just something that just didn't feel very hyped about it. And then you turn around and you see what the race developed to. It was sensational. What
do they say? Under deliver and over perform. It was an absolutely incredible race. So I think it was well worth it, don't you?
I do. I mean, it was, the thing that was really staggering is that it wasn't just the front runners that were elbows out. I mean, it was just everybody. And, I mean, the attrition rate also went on engines too with Honda. I mean, you're looking at a trio of Honda engines that ended up with some issues in those opening 56 laps. We saw a big name contender fall in Felix Rosenqvist there on lap 56. And I mean, there was a lot of people that had him tabbed to be in the fight at the end of this, just based on how they performed. And it was staggering to see that the attrition rate went all around, and rookies made rookie mistakes. Saw a really wild attempt, 4-wide attempt by Linus Lundqvist, the 2022 Indy Next champion, that did not pan out. And it just caught the guys like him out, and just unbelievable. I mean, you even had veterans like Marco Andretti that got collected, and Ryan Hunter-Reay and Scott Dixon ended up in an incident. I mean, you're talking about the likes of rookies, veterans, people who've won this race. It just shows how tough it is to pass and how much you really have to throw your car in there to try to make it work.
Absolutely, and I think another indication of that was Will Power as well. We did tip him to be performing very well, but he fell down the order from second as soon as the race began, really, and then eventually ended up crashing. What were his struggles, and how did he end up with, such a difficult performance after he had such a promising fortnight in the lead up to this race?
It's interesting. I would love to say, if you're basing it off of the past, it's because you're not supposed to be in the high lane. You're not supposed to be 2 grooves up on the bottom lane of the racetrack, because we just hadn't seen that come into play in previous races. Having said that, clearly there was something that was struggling with the handling. I mean, he was running on the high side, just above rookie Christian Rasmussen, who was sensational in his day with a respectable 12th place finish. But I mean, Power was running right there above him, and for whatever reason, the back end just snapped. And that was, whether it was the top lane or the bottom lane, that seemed to be a theme among certain drivers. I mean, Tom Blomqvist touched the curbing, so I kind of excused that. But I mean, Colton Herta touched the white line, I mean, and got sent around. And you look at Power, he was running by himself, didn't look like he was too sporty, didn't look like he was maybe too leaned out. What I can say is that there were so many drivers that talked about, with this track development, with the way that it progressed throughout the race, it really put the handling on edge, as evident by Pato having a couple of close saves. And I think in that situation with Power, it just caught him out.
Well, yes, obviously that ended Will Power's race, which was extremely unfortunate for him. But alongside him at the front of the grid was the eventual winner, Josef Newgarden. How impressive was that performance for you, Joey? I mean, it was just incredible through all 200 laps.
That was one of the most unbelievable performances that I've seen so far at the Speedway by somebody. I mean, you're looking at a guy in Josef who kind of bided his time throughout the whole situation, throughout the whole race, kind of fell back in the midway point and didn't quite know if he was going to be able to pull it back in. Somehow was able to do it. The car, the track, everything kind of started to come to him. He said the balance was good throughout the race, which was kind of surprising when you see where things ended up in the running order at the midway point. But started to really play into the race a little bit, started to learn exactly where the overcut needed to be. His team did a great job. Jonathan Duguid, who was kind of substituting with the strategy for Tim Cindric, who was suspended after that lovely push-to-pass scandal from earlier in the year. But, I mean, Duguid called a beautiful overcut there at the end that actually was an over on Rossi and an under on the likes of Pato and Scott Dixon. And that's really what panned out to work for Newgarden in that situation. But I think overall, the thing that was surprising with Josef that I did not see out of any other car the entire month is how close he could really follow. I mean, when he got passed by Pato going into turn 1 on the outside, every single time in years past, that's the race-winning move. The other guy cannot develop a run, can't spool up enough to be able to make a retaliated attack and respond. In this case, Josef was able to hang with him a little bit through the short chute and really going through turn 2 could pull. And even though Pato went down kind of below the white line where the apron was to try to break that toe and break that draft, Josef was able to kind of stay right there. And that's just something that you hadn't seen before. And you look at it just set up a great run going into 3. I'm still staggered, obviously, because I'm struggling with my words, but it's just one of those situations where it was uncanny. It's a simple way to say it. And he talked about after the race how a lot of it was down to the balance, that he felt comfortable. But I tell you, there's no other car that could quite suck up on another rival driver quite like what Newgarden's was.
Yeah, so in reality, the top 2 were just absolutely incredible. But finishing the top 5, or also included in the top 5, we have the 2 Chip Ganassi Racing drivers of Scott Dixon and Alex Palou, who got into the top 5 in the end after quite the lackluster qualifying. How impressive do you feel that their comeback was?
How do I say this? There is It was not too surprising when you know what they were capable of the last few years, but I think we were all kind of floored by what their lack of qualifying performance was. There was no reason that Scott Dixon should have been starting 21st in this race, and there's no reason that Alex Palou should have been struggling in the teens to start this race. So it was a great rebound by both of them, and honestly, Dixon continued to play into the pit strategy and really cycled in there. And that power accident that we talked about that happened around lap 147 or so, that's really where it favored Dixon, because he was already kind of at the front, kind of established, and that's really what vaulted him to stay among the contenders with that track position. I think also what's more staggering in that situation is we talk about the three engine issues for Honda. We talk about Chevy last week sweeping the top 6 spots, really the top 8 when it's all said and done. And Honda was nowhere to be found. I mean, they were trickled down in about 9th spot in qualifying, really didn't show much. They obviously struggled quite a bit with their engine, with the power, but somehow, some way, in what felt like a lesser mode, a lesser power unit, just they found a way to claw back. I mean, Honda really looked good with Colton, because Colton was running second before his crash around lap 88. And, you look at this, and the thing that I'm kind of astonished by is that Scott Dixon once again did Scott Dixon things, had an opportunity to fight for this thing. It's staggering to me what he's able to do for how long he's been in the series, what that team had been through. That row that he was in with Helio and Marco towards the back of the pack, I mean, neither one of them showed flashes with the exception of Dixon. I mean, he just figured out a way, and all three of those guys were on Honda power. Really, you look at this, and it was just a Herta and Dixon that really made it for the Japanese manufacturer, the Japanese power band. So it was staggering from that standpoint. It was definitely needed if he has aspirations for a 7th title. And then for Alex Palou, the reigning and 2-time champion for the series, this was definitely another one of those in the box that was just a calm, methodical drive. And it's staggering to me that this guy hasn't finished lower than 8th in over a year. We're approaching 2 years almost that Alex Palou hasn't had a finish lower than 8th. It absolutely floors me.
Yeah, he's an incredibly impressive driver. But just switching back to Scott for a second, there is that controversial penalty. Do you think, in your opinion, Joey, that he should have been penalised for that collision that happened with Ryan Hunter-Reay?
Honestly, yes. I mean, I look at that situation. Hunter-Reay did make a late move, and you could argue that Dixon was trying to set up for turn 3 a little bit, but you don't take turn 3 that low. That's number one. And it looked like it was a reactionary move that sent Ryan Hunter-Reay in the grass. Ended up ultimately led to Ryan Hunter-Reay's retirement, and he was running in the top 15. So solidly in the top 15 with an outfit that only ever runs the Indy 500 in Dreyer and Reinbold Racing. So I actually thought it was a penalty. I thought it should have been. And the fact that that's something that race control didn't call was probably the only thing that they seem to have gotten wrong all day. And in that situation, it's kind of hard to fault when there was one miscue. But having said that, certainly it would have been interesting to see how that would have changed who else was fighting at the front there if that had been called. And it would have been interesting to see. I have zero doubts that Dixon would have been able to fight back and get in the top 10. I mean, you look at where some of those cautions fell. You look at where that incident with Hunter-Reay was. There were still, I believe, 2 more cautions on the board to yet happen. And those other 2 cautions helped the likes of Kyle Larson get his lap back. It helped cycle a few different leaders, if you will. And even Takuma Sato, who was running in the top 10 that had a late penalty, had to restart at the rear of the field, managed to claw all the way back to the top 14. He ended up finishing 14th in this race, despite the fact that he had to restart somewhere around 23rd with about 45 laps to go, 55 laps to go, somewhere in there. I mean, it was just, this package showed that you could definitely pass, especially with the cooler conditions. So even with the penalty, I don't know if it makes a difference, but I do know that, in my opinion, it should have been a penalty.
And moving on, Joey, from kind of the front of the grid, let's step a little bit further back and talk about Kyle Larson, who ended up finishing 18th in his very first running of the Indy 500, which is quite the impressive result. He was on track to complete the double, but unfortunately, due to all of those weather delays, that didn't take place in the end. But it was a very impressive drive from him. Do you think he could be up for Rookie of the Year honours?
I do think he could be on for Rookie of the Year honors. I think it's between him and Christian Rasmussen, who finished 12th. But having said that, Larson qualifying 5th with a great team. He led laps. I think when you look at where things cycled out towards the end, when he got his lap back through pit sequences, he actually ended up leading 3 or 4 laps there towards the end. And look, this guy comes in to a foreign discipline, completely alien to him, and goes and qualifies 5th, was running in the top 10, and then right around that first pit stop, that first restart, I should say, ends up missing a shift, fades from the top 10, maybe runs down in about 14th, 15th, climbs all the way back into 6th, and was running back into the top 10, and was just kind of hanging around. And the only thing that seemed to catch him out was that pit road speeding penalty, just coming in too hot around lap 131 actually, and ended up receiving a penalty that he had to serve, a drive-through penalty he had to serve 3 laps later. So the fact that he went through that, learned that, went through the full highs and lows of what this experience was, got his lap back, restarted back in 23rd, clawed all the way back to 18th in a field that was easily the most intense and most competitive that anybody could hope for. I can't imagine being one of these 6 rookies thrown into what we saw on Sunday, because with it being as physical and elbows out and as intense as it was, you had to hold your ground. For a guy who's never driven one of these cars, that was a damn impressive effort.
Absolutely unbelievable to watch, and I think everybody enjoyed seeing that. Another driver, however, who did not have such a good race, Marcus Ericsson, obviously winner a couple of years ago, and it's not been a great month of May for him at all, and he was taken out here in the Indy 500 on lap 1 by a spinning Tom Blomqvist. Is he under a bit of pressure now at Andretti, or is that just how the cookie crumbles here?
I think in this situation, it's probably how the cookie crumbles. Andretti know what they have in Marcus Ericsson. I mean, Ericsson is an immense talent in this series, obviously winning the 500 in 2022. And it's only, 5 races into the season roughly? And so you're looking at 5 races in. The month of May was a big struggle. I mean, he ended up tubbing a car and ended up on a backup car. And obviously, when you start back there, I mean, Graham Rahal had this beautiful saying like 10 years ago, if you play around with the in the back of the field with all the squirrels, you're bound to find a nut. And, there's the sense that Ericsson ran into that. It was unfortunate what happened with Blomqvist. It was to be expected because you're sitting around all day, you're not running. Maybe you're not mentally as sharp, and you just have that small gaffe, that small error where just an inch of that sidewall of that tire touches that curbing and sent him around. And unfortunately, Ericsson, who started 32nd, but was starting to make up ground on that high side, even on the restart, because that's when you can really attack from the high side. There's a little bit of grip there. There's low speeds. That's the time that you can go hunting in this situation. And unfortunately, Blomqvist ended up finding him. So I don't get the sense that he's under the pressure from Andretti. I don't believe his ride's at stake or anything like that. I think he puts so much pressure on himself that he has to rebound from this. We go to Detroit. It's in his playground when you think about the street circuits because he's done well at Nashville. But I get the sense that unlike what happened in years past with Chip Ganassi Racing, where he would start out of the gate strong and then maybe slip a little bit and fade down to 5th or 6th in the championship through the midpoint of the season. I think this is a situation where it needs to be flipped. I think he has to come out and respond, and I think he needs to respond quickly at Detroit and follow that up with a great finish at Road America to really kind of shake loose of whatever nerves seem to be plaguing him. But I'll say this too. This isn't just an Ericsson thing. Outside of Kyle Kirkwood last year, Andretti Global haven't won IndyCar races. So, I think from that standpoint, this is also a situation where We know they run good. We know they got great drivers, but at some point you have to respond, and that needs to come very quickly for everybody in that lineup.
Definitely. So Marcus Ericsson, not quite under pressure, but I want to talk about who went under the radar, because 33 cars were on this grid. We've only spoken of a handful of drivers. Joey, was there anyone that we've not talked about yet who you think deserves a bit of kudos after this race and really impressed you throughout the 200 laps?
I mean, there's quite a few that impressed. I mean, when you got 200 laps, it's a very long race, right? So, I mean, it was impressive to see, even though it was kind of an alternative pit strategy after the opening lap wreck that saw Connor Daly and Stingray Robb pit on lap 4. They cycled to the lead a couple of times, and Stingray, despite the fact that he's been looked at as kind of a back marker with a Foyt team that isn't quite as competitive as the likes of Penske and Ganassi and Arrow McLaren, he showed up and he showed well, and kind of did what his teammate Santino Ferrucci did a little bit last year with being out front and leading laps. So it was a strong showing for him, even though the result wasn't there. Connor Daly, obviously finishing 10th. It's a one-off effort for him. I talked to him after the race, and he's just like, man, I don't think I have anything left to show anybody out here to warrant to acknowledge that I'm deserving of a full-time ride. He goes, I 100% think that I deserve a full-time ride. So he's still searching for that, and a 10th place run doesn't hurt in his case. But I also want to give a shout out to Agustin Canapino. I mean, even though the result was not there for him, you're talking about a guy that was running solidly in the top 6, could have easily been a player in that final stint, coming down to pit road for that final round of pit stops, ended up scuffing it and overstepping and speeding and getting caught out by that and had to serve a drive-through penalty. But that was for a guy that came from a completely different discipline and touring cars in Argentina. The fact that his second Indy 500, when speeds are in excess of 225 miles an hour in a race like this, he fought his way up there. Could have easily qualified in the top 12 too, mind you, if he didn't have that awkward boost plenum issue that Chevrolet had been dealt with. So that's a guy that continues to find a measured craft within this discipline, and I think that if they keep that up, he's definitely in store for something special. So maybe a little bit overlooked, but I don't think it can be understated how impressive he was running prior to that moment.
Yeah, well, potentially one to watch for next year for the 109th running of the Indy 500. But I think that wraps up our review of the 108th running this year of the Indianapolis 500. It has been an absolute pleasure to break this down with you, Joey. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a long night for you, and the job's not quite done yet, is it?
No, definitely not. I mean, we've burned the midnight oil, as they say, but we do it because we love it, and it's been a blast, and I can't thank you enough for having me once again.
Well, Joey, there is no rest for the wicked, and also the series will get underway in Michigan for the Detroit Grand Prix this coming Sunday, so no rest for them either. We've had 2 races of the Triple Crown this year. In a couple of weeks, we'll head to the 24 Hours of Le Mans, so be sure to stay up to date with all of the content here on Autosport. But until next time, thank you very much for watching.